People filter in, a few more just kind of dropping in as we kind of talking, but without further ado, we can certainly get started. So thank you all for joining us today. We have our kind of session today based around kind of focusing on a topic that's certainly kind of becoming more and more prevalent across lots of different kind of environments, is, you know, kind of addressing the different changes that have happened with increasing kind of digital adoption across services, but also kind of just always an increasing profile of how we're managing security and risk. So it's really then the session today is looking as a purpose to kind of help share knowledge and awareness. So it isn't really intended on kind of being too pointy on pitching side of things or anything like that, but it would be around looking to kind of ideally share relevant information and data with you good selves and really kind of talk from a point of view of experiences that we've had and our other customers and organizations that we've worked with, you know, have been experiencing and also handling these sort of things. With that kind of said, it's going to really then kind of focus on a couple of key elements that we'll look to try and ensure we answer today. And so in today's session, we are going to kind of look a little bit around that kind of real kind of key thing around data protection and how that is managed within Microsoft and Office 365, or how we can look to protect our data within the Microsoft and Office 365 services. And think around, well, actually, what are then the approaches, or how are the kind of ways that people are working now, given how things have changed over the last number of years, and then what's kind of realistic around that, what's kind of implementation times, costs, kind of recovery speeds. But I think one of the things we're going to try and do today as well is also help give a little bit of a framing of kind of things to consider, as it's certainly fair to say that there are options and there are lots of kind of areas out there in terms of how you could approach something. And although they can have similarities, not everything is made equal in that sense. And really that's then going to come down to like what is really kind of key and important to you to really help you look at how you're balancing your risk versus your budget, and how that then is feeding into your general kind of disaster and your recovery planning and your approach to really kind of give yourselves that confidence and resilience in how you move forwards. So with that, you've got a couple of speakers on today. So you've got myself and also Ricky. So I'll just quickly introduce myself and let Ricky say hello. So Phil Mercer, I'm the CEO at Power On, although it's certainly fair to say that I do a few different bits and pieces. And, you know, at the end of the day, you always got to do what you kind of enjoy. And so I've spent most of my time always kind of really working with customers and doing a lot around how advising and guiding in regards to adoption and strategy and technology. So I always tend to say that I am technical, but not the techie, but so we normally kind of support a good conversation. But yeah, Ricky?
Yeah, sure thing. Ricky Patel, a pre-sales lead here at Power On. So previously coming from more of a technical background in the world of config manager, Intune, the modern VDI side of things, and over the past 2 to 3 years now, transitioned to more of a pre-sales role. So then gradually expanding my knowledge into the space of backup, disaster recovery, identity and access. But from a day-to-day, I mainly kind of work through with our account managers and our clients through our challenges, pain points, and road mapping exercises.
Sounds good. All right. And one key thing with this is, as this session is very much geared at looking to share knowledge, it's also pretty key to say that, you know, given the kind of context, we're going to try and make this as relevant to the group as we can, but it's never going to be better than if we can actually kind of make it relevant to you good selves more specifically. So we welcome questions, you know, please do ask those. There are lots of little nuances in IT, as I'm sure I don't need to say onto anyone on this phone, in terms of how this really may or may not apply in your scenario, your situation. So feel free to submit questions. We will be kind of monitoring them through the course of the kind of the quick sessions day, and we have then a part at the end of it just really to look to kind of wrap those and answer those questions. And of course, you know, we can certainly kind of send updates and answers out following this, which we would naturally do to give you those information parts as well. So without that then said, what we'll kind of quickly get into, and there's a little bit of a quick intro, and thinking really around also where is some areas why Microsoft 365 Backup is becoming more prevalent and how we're kind of seeing different organizations adopt and react. But it's fair to say that there's still quite a lot of misconceptions in the space in terms of where the need or the requirement's going to come from and how that starts to influence what we do and how we approach it. And of course, how we actually then need to get support from the business to engage with that. So I think one of the kind of side of things to think about is the most common part that we talked about, and to be fair, it'll be talked about in this session today as well, is the ransomware and ransomware threat relevant to it and how that's affecting our backup kind of scenario. And then it's still certainly very fair to say that that is a key factor, because although actually, as we can kind of see, ransomware is certainly a persistent threat that we have to consider and manage and look to address, but it isn't necessarily something that's going to be occurring to us on daily. And when we kind of think around items and environments like Microsoft 365, It's something that is used by all of our users on a regular cadence and their primary drive. So actually the vast majority of where we've considered data losses or have data losses within the actual Microsoft 365 and service environment there still comes very much from human error. So general accidental deletion, overwrites and considerations there. And then yes, the hacking and insider threats, so both from a point of view of malicious activities that may happen within organizations from that, but also actually the ransomware attack sides. But of course, the difference there being a small individual single error event and a significant, potentially, impactful organizational event in how that affects us. As well as then there can be errors within general third party, depending on the kind of services that you integrate into your Office 365 stack and how that's then really kind of supporting the different works that your kind of team members are currently conducting today. So really think about that. We need to then think about both balancing how we're bringing something in that kind of provides us with a confidence level around cyber resilience and how that's kind of changed the affect in terms of where we'd have come at it before, where there would be, the kind of areas previously would be very much kind of protecting against traditional disaster events, where Microsoft provide that kind of service availability, where, we're not necessarily going to be risking fire or flood relevant to the services, but we do still have that same compromise and actual malicious intent of data, as well as then that kind of general accidental deletions and such, where it comes back to what is the kind of support for the usability of the service? How easy is it for our IT teams to be able to manage that? And how much actually can we also start to think about delegation down to provide better controls and better support into the organization itself? And when we kind of think about maybe where some of these changes are kind of coming from in regards to how environments have shifted, it's certainly fair to say, of course, generally, given the fact we're talking about Microsoft 365 Backup, service have gone digital, cloud orientated, and significant space. So that's kind of growing then this change in needs in terms of how and where our data resides, and hence how we need to manage it. But with the kind of rising kind of profile in terms of both the speed of technology change and the ability to maintain that from a point of view of available kind of skills, resources within teams, vulnerabilities from inconsistent updates and patching of different services, and that can be a wider range across access methods as well. So actually with data and the access models coming in to having a range, it kind of adds areas that we need to ensure are covered and protected. So having that kind of wide variety of users, access scenarios, and how that kind of processes comes in, as well as essentially then contending with the kind of the changing threats in terms of more sophisticated attacks and a growing piece where general larger macro factors that are kind of affecting us as organizations, where continuing limited budgets and constraints on resources, as well as then an area of how we're actually kind of continuing and maintaining skills. So we need to think around how can we bring in these solutions without necessarily driving significant over complexity, but also being mindful of how can they kind of keep pace with what's actually moving within the services that are happening and continually evolving from a Microsoft 365 side of things as well. So additional kind of really kind of common misconceptions that kind of come into this is, traditionally speaking, a lot of times it can be that, well, we're protected because we do backups, or one of the biggest ones certainly relevant to the kind of the Microsoft 365 side is, well, we don't need to back up as our data is in the cloud. I think key things that have changed and where also the kind of the backup market's been going, and you'll have seen it probably very heavily, I'm sure, in the last kind of 4 years, whereas previous pivot was very much on disaster and kind of data resiliency and protection, it's all around security, typically the messaging that you get from your backup vendors today. And that's really kind of the pointiness of how things have changed, where the backup is certainly very much a target, but it's also the basis by which your kind of first point of recovery, your fallback, your hard point that you can give confidence that you can get back in the event of an attack. But by that very nature, it creates itself then as a primary attack for the actual individuals that are looking to seek to disable your capabilities to recover, and so force you into a method of actually having to still, be basically prone to the actual need to pay the ransom or other bits and pieces. So it means it changes the dynamic of also what that backup provision and service needs to do. So it has to have then a very strong bias of how it is secure, how it is resilient, as well in terms of the service that kind of comes through. And it's also really key to note that a lot of times, and this was certainly kind of reinforced, unfortunately, by the early days when cloud was kind of coming through, very much a conception, should we say, both promoted by different areas of practices such as vendors, but also certain areas of partners actually kind of communicating out to customers that it's great, cloud protects all your stuff, you don't need to worry about it. And that misconstrue of the actual areas of shared responsibility was certainly done. It even still happens today. I remember just speaking to a customer just the other month, and they were saying their relevant SharePoint partner was telling them how they didn't need to worry about it because Microsoft backed up all their SharePoint data. Unfortunately, that is just fundamentally not true. And so the difference really kind of comes down to Microsoft provides service availability, not data protection. So in terms of that, they are looking to ensure your service is available. It has redundancies, so their storage has redundancies and stuff like that, but that is protecting against disk failures or certain disk corruption size. It does not provide data protection. So although things like that are highly available, it does mean that actually you don't have that ability to request Microsoft to restore data services. There are certain minimal elements they put in, but it is not backup and it isn't data protection. And to that note, Microsoft make it clear within their own kind of shared responsibility and the service availability terms within their kind of product use and product operational rights is essentially to say they recommend for you to actually back your contact data up with services, third party or otherwise, to essentially provide that kind of missing capability that currently is not provided by the Microsoft service. Now, it's interesting to hear that Microsoft are talking about potentially entering the backup arena, but there isn't actually any timeline in terms of when that's going to come through. And when I say talking about entering the backup arena, I mean on the M365 side. They already do services on Azure and different bits and pieces that you can add to your capabilities, but they don't do it for the Microsoft 365 services at this point in time. So it is one of those key things.
I was just going to say, Phil, in regards to backup being a target, are we seeing an increase in kind of the M365 backups being more of a target in the on-premise side of things, or based on kind of more and more organizations taking on and things like M365 backups, or maybe not having a backup solution in place for their M365 data?
I think it's an interesting one. So I would say that there is a bit of a combination of both. I think one of the parts that can be exploited is that where there was certain services that were, shall we say, expedited to move into cloud, one of the key things that then didn't necessarily get addressed so robustly was the access profiles for that. So we did see a number of organizations that had a lot of the data services in cloud and they hadn't really fully secured their user access model, and the users are still a very primary attack model for external cyber criminals to essentially kind of come through. So then yes, essentially then gives them the ability to get in for a start to provide lateral movement and elevated access into it. And then your Office 365 data is as vulnerable to being encrypted and essentially made unavailable to you as any other service data would be. So yes, it wouldn't necessarily say there is, say, a really strong preference to it over others. Microsoft do provide you with a whole bunch of stuff that, depending on your licensing, that you can add to really lock that access and control mechanisms down. So you can really kind of provide a good levels of external barrier protection, which we could get into. But it's fair to say that there were certainly areas where cloud adoption was ramped up during the kind of COVID period. That meant that some of the things were expedited without necessarily full protections being in play that would otherwise have been present in certain physical security locations from legacies. And so it did present a little bit, unfortunately, higher risk for certain areas and certain organizations.
Okay.
If that helps answer, hopefully.
Yeah.
So with that then kind of said around it, it's really just kind of reinforcing this point to the organizations and businesses. One of the key things would be is if you haven't done Microsoft 365 backup before and then you're introducing it to the organization, the first question is going to be, well, why? And so, there is an evolution of that in terms of what was previously recognized needs to be recognized as the need is there. The presence of that kind of cyber threat is far more relevant. So actually, although Microsoft provides pretty good support for data availability and certain levels of resilience there, they do not provide data protection. And so we need to be adding in that data protection to give ourselves that confidence. But of course, does add in that backup truly, so you can better recover from user mistakes or user errors and other things that will come in. But it's repositioning that back to the organization to kind of reaffirm that need for the data protection side that's going to really kind of be a requirement if you don't currently back up Microsoft 365 data today. And so it's things like, the misconception around like apps are protected from ransomware. They're not, unfortunately. Microsoft will sell you a load of stuff that you can use to help you with that, but ultimately they are not protected from the ransomware side of things by default. Microsoft 365 not backed up as Microsoft, as we said. You do have certain elements that I mentioned, like version histories and Microsoft Recycle Bin, but that is not true data protection. And the recycle bin is pretty questionable in terms of actually how well you can use that, even at the best of times, but it's a 30 to 90 day, type of cover. And I think it is also prone to ensure that, it is a moving goalpost. So the business protects against cyber attacks sometimes can be a conception, but actually how is that protecting us against risk, error, and also how robust is that in the context of it, which is a risk consideration, which we'll talk to as we kind of go through some of the capability sides. But it is key to say that, that things have changed, the data protection prevalence is much higher, and it is a gap for a lot of organizations where it hasn't been previously addressed. So it's something that really needs to be then brought into focus, as it were. So when we think about that, actually one of the good news is, as things have changed, also so has the market moved to be able to kind of support better customers and environments in terms of how that kind of comes through. So although there are a number of things to consider, as there are in some respects in all kind of technology choices that we have, as we always have many in technology, it doesn't have to necessarily be actually a really difficult question to answer, and it's something that you can be able to get moving on quick. But what we're trying to then do is think about how do we consolidate some of those kind of key questions to ask and to get answered that helps you then kind of really make your choice in terms of what makes sense for you. So when thinking about this, I mentioned at the start the thing with the backup side of things is there is lots of vendors out there, lots of different options that you could go with. There are vendors that have kind of come from traditional sides. So when we think around those infrastructure backup vendors, been around for 20, 25 plus years and other bits and pieces, and they've evolved their technology stack, and they can have a really good, really mixed, strong environment stack. But depends on where they're at in terms of their kind of thought process, because a lot of those will still be set on kind of more of an infrastructure-based solution, although kind of a number of the more leading ones have developed further into more cloud-native capabilities. But then what we're kind of seeing within the Microsoft 365 space and the general side around the service side is that the most prevalent side that is seen as a stronger value position, primarily because it mirrors the idea around your kind of cloud service orientation. So it is a cloud to cloud backup side. So rather than it being an infrastructure side where you have to build it, you maintain it, and you control the different parts, it's essentially a similar SaaS subscription that you then essentially kind of subscribe to. You don't have to manage any of the infrastructure components, and it allows you to kind of bring that through. Now that does mean it stands as a component, but it's certainly something then that actually kind of provides. So what we're going to talk more to today is those types of focuses, as they are certainly becoming, from a general kind of market adoption side, the vastly more preferred way of going about things. And a lot of the big reasons for that is coming down to both the ease by which you can get it going and get it used, the simplicity in some of the actual kind of infrastructure maintenance and licensing models, as well as then just generally kind of usability and support and such. So what we kind of talk to a little bit here is again, just trying to kind of call out, well, we've done like reviews with lots of different vendors to support into certain customers. We do a lot of kind of consultancy engagements and help with advisory side. So just try to consolidate what we would kind of think of as some of the key things to think about and where differences happen when trying to choose a solution that balances both that data protection confidence with elements in regards to usability and making it easier to handle those kind of user errors. So when we think about security within a cloud-to-cloud or a SaaS backup selection, yeah, we're going to have some bare minimums, right? Things like data encryption, data in transit, certifications of where the data is held, so ISOs and all that kind of good stuff, depending on your primary prevalence of location and industry. But when we then think about some of the kind of key considerations where you're going to get differences, where you're going to get reasonably strong differences. So one part that really would be prevalent now and is becoming a continual conversational point would be such things like data immutability. And I think we call this out as well because it's very fair to say that people do it in lots of different ways. So they use the term immutability is coming as a just general statement, but there isn't really a standard for it. So what I'd call out here is that when you look to these vendors, you'll typically find there are going to be kind of like, say, 2 or 3 types by which they address the immutability conversation. So you'll have one which I would say personally is not immutable, but argument in the statement is what I would kind of describe as immutability by process. So in that context, the cloud-to-cloud provider would say to you that you can't change the data, only we can, and hence it's immutable. Now, what they're really saying there is actually it's just more of a restricted access side. It's not actually that the storage itself is protected or immutable, and hence then it really is putting the emphasis on your ability to trust that partner to have the necessary protections and control mechanisms and other bits and pieces in play. So you may be comfortable with that, you may not. Where we start to see other types as well is then where you kind of get DIY immutable. And so that tends to be something where the storage is being configured to be read once, write many, but it can be changed. So there's different parties that provide different services to that. But ultimately, the point there is it is immutable, but it can unfortunately be turned off. So how much is it locked immutable? And then you kind of get that more proprietary immutability, where again, it can be achieved in a few different ways. But essentially that is then saying the actual storage subsystem is set to be fixed immutable and it cannot be changed in respect of that. Now, again, it's gradations in how that's said, but there are then vendors that will provide that type of capability. And you see, different services coming forwards where even they're looking to move to that. So where we see newer stuff coming through from, let's say, Microsoft in certain Azure backups, even though they're not really in the M365 space, they now have that immutable locked capability within their Azure storage accounts. And so there are more cloud vendors moving to this, but what it is certainly fair to say is you're going to get a higher prevalence of the first two rather than the third. So it depends on how strongly you want that real cyber resilience confidence baked into your actual kind of components. And then we think around back to that is around security controls. So depending on the level of real resilience confidence, it's still going to have a kind of a key note in terms of how we actually controlling the identity and access. As one of the big things when we move to in the cloud services is really thinking around how we're kind of creating that sort of digital means of access controls they would have had much more prevalently in physical means previously. So we think around things like conditional access in terms of like policy-based drivers for things like MFA or driving into things like single sign-on that allows us to really kind of give then a better level of confidence of how we're only selectively giving out or more zero trust or kind of just right in time access. And that kind of ties in then with also kind of role-based access controls. So we think about the combination, we have the access control medium, but we also then think about where we're granting access to. So we do want to work on that basis of least privilege. And so what you will find in the different vendors is there are certainly a range of how granular their role-based access control mediums can be. Some are very simplistic, others do give you that much more granular control, and some go right into depth, so you can be really super diligent around it depending on your organizational profile of what you really need to deliver. And then thinking very much around user activity auditing, as well as kind of number of backup copies. And this kind of comes a bit more into your actual kind of cyber response plans. And so depending on, again, how focused you would be into these areas, it would be around, well, actually, we are going to need to do a recovery event. How much do we need to do kind of actual analysis of what's happened? So there is an element around needing to find the last clean space. And so having a more clear, detailed visibility side really helps you in that kind of more forensic analysis side that you want to do with the multiple backup copies beginning on the lower end of the conversation. But if you're still wanting to comply with elements such as like 3-2-1 principles, then also a lot of the kind of cloud vendors will operate actually just on a single copy protection, but with kind of storage redundancies, whereas others will provide you multiple copies, so you can meet that then 3-location position on actually how your data is stored. So source first, second, giving you 3 copies across that basis.
And Phil, on that, are we seeing an increase in kind of vendors increasing the number of copies that they're making just based on that 3-2-1 method, or is it kind of a bit of a mix depending on the vendors?
So not so much within the cloud SaaS space, to be honest. So it's an interesting one within the cloud SaaS space. What you'll tend to find is most of the arguments will sit around, or I say arguments, most of the counterpoint positions will be that, well, we've got redundancy on the disk. So let's say a lot of the SaaS vendors will store their data in Azure. And so their position on that is, well, we have a single copy, but it's on LRS storage, and then LRS storage has 3 redundant copies. But that's more disk redundancy rather than actually a separated physical copy of the actual data. So you tend to find that is the positional argument they take. And there's probably a direct link then certainly to the aspect of cost, because a lot of the SaaS vendors side of things work on a fixed cost, unlimited storage. And so having multiple copies introduce a cost consideration element and management element and stuff like that. So no is the short answer. There are vendors that absolutely do it, because they would then be the more security conscious areas of those vendors, although, personal opinion, depending on what you consider security conscious, of course, but they certainly offer those capabilities. So there are a range of the enterprise end that do it, but yeah, you'll find more commonly that they'll place the data either in Azure or AWS as a single copy point offsite. And so when we then think around, kind of expanding out, so the security piece is really one of the bigger components when we start to think about it. But when we think about workload protection and tying back then into that data protection layer as well, it's certainly fair to say, of course, minimum expectation would be that it backs up Microsoft 365 core services. Probably fairly obvious and fairly easy to say. But I think one of the key things to think about is like, what would you consider that you want to be able to restore? And so, post this, we can share with you some basic comparative ideas to kind of think about. But the kind of key consideration here is that you'll find there are quite a few differences between the level of granularity of functional control products have. So many will say, we back up SharePoint, brilliant, but they don't back up site permissions and they don't back up metadata. So the issue then with that is actually when you come to do a restore event or a more significant restore event, then you're having to go and manually recreate those site permissions and you're losing the metadata. So you then don't have version histories and other bits and pieces being restored alongside that. And you can find areas where things like teams and stuff as well, like, what we found is a number of organizations, although it's certainly probably more on the nice to have area than not, but if you've got a strong consciousness around user experience on a restore event, Teams chat can get not backed up at all, or sometimes it'll be backed up, but if you try and restore it, it'll only just like restore it as a PDF file or something along those kind of lines, rather than necessarily actually restoring the chat. And certainly what we've seen a lot within organizations is that growing prevalence of chat and collaboration channels being far more where those teams put all their information, and hence then obviously the satisfaction events, if they can't actually kind of get that back, would certainly be kind of something that would be keen to note. And I suppose the final part around certain functionalities would be around thinking about there's a lot of Microsoft sub-services that are typically not covered, but actually they are continually being added by the different vendors. But we think about there things like then Planner, for example, would be one where it becomes more and more used by organizations. But again, depends a little bit on your kind of level of detail of need, but it's worth certainly calling out when people talk about we do Microsoft 365 backup, there are reasonably significant differences within that statement. And so it's just good to be able to double check what you really set as your kind of functional minimum, as it were. And what I think would add into that is one of the key things that most of them don't do, but there are a number, and there are people coming on more and more into this space, is Azure AD. Now it's interesting because it's also kind of commonly missed within your on-premise components as well. But essentially in the Azure AD side, it is around then actually users, groups, all the different membership side of things that we think about, but also going potentially to more advanced components like your conditional access policies, your MFA policies, your Intune and BitLocker and encryption keys and stuff like that. Because that kind of source of the truth of your user information, your access details will absolutely also be a target of attack. If someone's trying to cripple your ability to restore, taking that out is a reasonably good place to start. So it's then a lot of manual work to start to restore that, manage the restore of that kind of side of things as well. So it's certainly one that can be a desirable part, but one that's also quite commonly not necessarily considered as the main thing people will think to is the data protection side, but actually a key part of data restoration is also the ability to assign that actually to the user access and the user permission side. So Azure AD does become an increasing profile of need in respect of that. And then I think just finally, in terms of some of the service considerations, yes, we want to make sure things like, because this service is something that's working on a collaboration tool, whether the technology is moving constantly, you're adding and changing users all the time, minimum expectations, things around solid automatic discovery capabilities, good daily backups, reporting, health alerting being really key as well. Because we're talking about a service that connects typically over kind of an authentication side and then API communication access back into a storage medium is something we need to ensure is live, healthy and up, as otherwise it's not backing up basically. And so there can be the obvious thing that really just need to make sure there's good health alerting that we can see to ensure that that service is active and is working as expected, as would be pretty much a consideration of any service. But with a backup side, it is not always immediately obvious that it isn't. And so health alerting is pretty crucial. But when we think about then some of the key considerations around this, things like geolocation could be certainly one. I think the kind of two main things there is how able are you to set the location of your recovery data vault, but also a lot of time we found, certainly more in public sector organizations, but it's true in different services depending on your approach to considerations of data, is that actually because a lot of the vendors hold data in Azure, then actually there's a lack of confidence in that from a point of view of having both your Office 365 data and your backup data essentially held in the same service. And so then there can be preferences towards different parts. There's certainly a debate on that statement, but that is certainly true in the context of where people are coming at it from. The debate in my mind is more about the effect that truly has in regards to resiliency and use. But if there's that strong preference around that, then certainly that's a key consideration to consider, as a lot of the vendors do put the data in Azure or AWS. Data transfer optimization can also be something we'll talk a little bit onto that in a moment, but it's basically how much can this allow you to improve your speed of transfer, as that's always a consideration when we work with backup, both from a backup position, but also key from a recovery window side of things. And then thinking really as we start to go into things like self-service, user validation, how much can we provide a little bit more pre-checks to users when we're talking about a lot of user mistakes. IT support is having to try and confirm that what they're asking us to restore is the right thing. Are there areas where that can make it easier so that we can really try and cut down that operational overhead in terms of actually how that's affecting our first line support desk and the general tickets and support services that we're kind of providing in? I'm thinking then as well around how it kind of ties in generally to our data privacy and data retention and kind of storage limits that we need to meet from kind of regulatory and general kind of privacy and support needs that we would have. So when we think about this, I'm not going to spend too much time on this next bit, but the context of it, just wanted to kind of like make it a little bit real around these things. So these are meant to help just give you a bit of guidance around the things to consider and where you can maybe put a bit of a specification to any kind of vendor things you may or may not look at. But just to make it a little bit real, let's apply this to maybe a product stack and an example vendor that we found that through assessments, different things, tends to be a pretty good balance of strong enterprise capability whilst being considerate of costs and other considerations that kind of come within that. So one that we kind of do some work with, and there's a couple that we do work with in regards to it, depending on what's a fit and what's right for the kind of customer environment, is say something like an ArcServe SaaS. And so some of the key kind of things that kind of come through from that is it is really kind of then addressing those areas where Azure AD kind of comes into the mix. It has then the considerations around that more permissions and site and metadata side, so the restore experience is certainly kind of coming through, and then thinking about how that kind of goes across the different services that kind of come into the mix with that core functional capabilities across. It's still of course moving with the times as well, so there's certainly areas where it's developing on certain newer capabilities for certain Microsoft services that are kind of coming through, but a very strong kind of profile of kind of backup and kind of fuller coverage that kind of comes across it. So when we then think about some of the areas that kind of come in terms of how it works and where it would kind of be as a selection size, it's then think about, so we talked briefly around the actual data transfer side and how that kind of connects in. And this kind of then connects into the access and also the kind of role-based access control side of things. So one thing to note with the SaaS backup perspectives is they work generally off the Microsoft 365 kind of Office REST and API kind of protocols, and there are a number that sit there within Microsoft. So Microsoft have a few that essentially provide access to the different Office 365 services, like essentially SharePoint, like Exchange, etc. So they are split. So you can break those down. Now, some vendors will just go on a single connector, connects to all APIs and drags all the data at the same time. But where, say, something like this, and this is where different vendors can offer elements of comparatives where it breaks down into individual connectors. What that means is it means that we can really then look to think about how we optimize the traffic and how we then kind of gate what bits of the environment are kind of coming in. So there are then best practices around how you can really look to speed up the data transferal rate. And there's also things you can then tie back into Microsoft, because you can put, based on the different services, you can do things like request the throttling policies to be changed from Microsoft. So there are things that we can do to really think about how do we address one of the kind of pragmatic issues when using a kind of a SaaS or a backup cloud service of data transfer and speed of data transfer to be able to kind of give us that confidence within our backup considerations. When we think about then tying that into, say, certain parts around role-based and access controls, that then ties into both, because the connectors are set on a service type, they're also then set with quite a high level of discoverability. So what you can do is you can then set, in this context with this product, so you can set it so that you can really have granular role-based controls based on elements of service. So you could say something like, I only want them to be able to access the Exchange service for the HR team, and this person has access to manage that, but other people don't, for example. So if you wanted to have that level of role-based granularity control around who can restore what data, who can see what data is in different sections, if you wanted to do certain levels of security control access, that's the kind of thing you can do. Again, optimizing traffic, but also giving yourselves around that kind of confidence of it. And that ties in as well with things like the MFA and the single sign-on part. Interestingly, within this technology, how it addresses the immutability side is it's quite advanced in the context that it leverages blockchain. So it leverages Merkle tree blockchain. And so that then gives us that kind of the storage subsystem itself is set as immutable from the get-go and works through in the context of that. So giving us that extra level of confidence that it is really kind of addressing that. And that partners in with elements around actually having the data center in private DCs based across the globe, where you can also do data sovereignty, as well as having the copies at source and in then 2 data center locations within the sovereign area that you're selecting to be able to give you then that kind of 3 copy side of things. So I didn't want to go too much into this because it isn't necessarily maybe a product pitch per se, but it was to try and make real some of those components and how those apply. And of course, happy to answer kind of questions or kind of go across that in a little bit more. But I think kind of key elements there really is around how is it integrating for speed of backup? How is it really achieving both the access controls and also the immutability to give yourself that confidence of data resiliency? But also how does that then kind of tie back into the speed and ease of recovery so we can be confident that our teams can actually get that back up and manage that. So being conscious of time a little bit as well, but what's realistic then? So think about this and put it at high level. I think, generally speaking, although there is no actual definitive stats, because the standard answer is it depends. When we think about data speeds, and I talked a little bit just there to how you can start to optimize, there are a number of things you can do to optimize, but simple things like time of day affects it, as we all kind of probably appreciate and know. So we're going to be doing this on the weekend, we're going to get better speeds as the general level of use, because it is still going to have levels of throttling. It is going to be affected by Microsoft usage and how different people are consuming those services. But what you'll typically find is, generally speaking, the products will range from around about 1 to 6 terabytes per day of kind of backup speed. But it can be optimized, especially for larger organizations where they might have wider distributed environments and different kind of regions for where their different services are. There is, again, things that can be done, but even for, kind of, and when I say large organizations, I mean pretty big organizations, in regards to it, but it can be still optimized across the board. But, what you'll typically find is that your data speed. So that's the consideration, both from a general kind of backup profile, but also from a point of view of when you do your first build. Because one of the things that's certainly fair to say is that the cloud-to-cloud SaaS kind of product like this, the benefit of it is super quick to set up. The general premise on pretty much all these products is they work fundamentally on some type of connector or kind of integration into your Office 365 tenancy. And so primarily, you typically just need someone, either an account or some a relevant permission base to grant access and authorization to integrate into it. Depending on how they set it up, it might be an app, it might be a connector, it might actually be a user account that allows you to do that. But the point being is that pretty much all you have to do is get the actual connection up and running. And then it's a little bit more about the configuration of role-based controls, users that you've got set up within it, and certain elements in regards to how you want to manage the granularity of, say, distribution. But if you keep it a fairly flat, fairly high level architecture, you can be set up literally in the space of an hour or so. And that sounds a bit ridiculous, but it is genuinely true. However, the difference is it's not to then think that you're instantaneously got all of your data protected and everything else. There will be the fundamental seeding time. And so on that first backup, based on those kind of data speeds, it is going to take a number of days or even weeks to actually kind of get your first full recovery. But the general point of view of getting yourself set up is pretty minimal and is very rapid. And then it is then starting to protect your environment, but it'll just take time to get that initial full done. But once it's done, it's incremental. So it's only kind of really replicating the changes side. So then you should be confident of not having any of that kind of lag delay or the considerations that kind of come around that. And given the fact that it is typically very light on the setup, it's normally not anything that you really need to particularly pay for per se. There's obviously a cost in the product, but it would be more around, say, if you wanted extra levels of support, training, and other stuff. But what you'll also find is typically there'll be access to certain materials and resources for that. So the process is pretty easy normally to actually get it set up. but readiness is a consideration, and just how much you want to go into the detail of actually configuring. Cost models is an interesting one. So there is a wide range of kind of cost models in respect of this. If we're thinking more on those traditional vendors we said at the start, they're going to be more traditional licensed on license and infrastructure and such. But if we think about the cloud SaaS side, they will predominantly all work on the basis of having a user-based license. They'll mostly all grant you free use of shared mailboxes up to a certain size limit, which is typically actually linked into the way the Microsoft sizing limit works as well. So once you go over a certain size, Microsoft charges you for shared mailboxes, etc. So what you'll tend to find is that most of the SaaS 365 will give you a licensing model pretty much on a one-to-one relationship with how many Microsoft 365 licenses you have. Not always the case, but relatively speaking, true. But the cost then can range and vary reasonably. You know, probably you'd be thinking something between the lines of, you know, maybe interestingly, actually, a number of the SaaS vendors have actually increased their prices more recently. So we've kind of seen in the market over the last kind of 6 months, kind of generally about a 20-25% increase in costs. And I think that's been certainly triggered from past pieces around, you know, changes in electricity and storage costs that have come from the cloud vendors as well. So that knock-on trickle effect of that. But I would say that, you know, you can probably looking really in the regions of kind of like high 20s per user per year to as a low end. Mid to high 20s as a lower end, depending on if you go for a more pro level product rather than enterprise level products, you know, going up to then, you know, kind of high 40s, 50 at the high end per user per year. Now, of course, that's more general opening gambit type prices. Naturally speaking, you can negotiate. And so I think certainly going for things where you get multi-year commitments can be very advantageous. I would especially say in the climate at the moment with the cost changes, it can also be advantageous for cost avoidance. And so both getting typically better level discounts and also cost avoidance for potentially any kind of future price increase changes, you know, committing to say something like a 3-year deal can be definitely beneficial for you. So it'd certainly be something that would advise. You don't obviously have to, it is a subscription type motion, but it certainly is something that you'll typically find you'll get better mileage in regards to your kind of cost of your bias, normally getting like, you know, a good 20-30% off. But if you go for like a 3-year deal type of stuff is pretty reasonable to expect in regards to it. And then I think just finally, the one thing is I mentioned a little bit on the training, that actually the training side is really power user stuff. There's very little administrational areas of considerations with these types of products. But one thing that's absolutely crucial to note is it is still a backup product that needs to be monitored. So keeping an eye on the health of that service is crucial. And so doing that is really important, because what you don't want to have happen is find that the authorization between the connections has dropped. And so effectively you've been thinking it's been backing up for the last 3 months, and it hasn't. So a bare minimum of alert and health considerations, of course, as well as kind of response, but you do need to ensure you've got that active management on it. And that's in fairness true of all backup stuff, but it's certainly key to know that you do consider that as part of anything you kind of do to look to move forwards with. Is certainly a very strong recommendation from our side. And so really kind of with that said, you know, it's certainly then quite possible to achieve then with looking into these kind of Microsoft 365 data protections, you know, and articulation the fact that things have changed, data protection rise in respect of that, the need to make sure that's covered within your Microsoft 365 service, but actually also saying that there are kind of solutions out there that don't have to be super complicated to implement. It is important to choose the one that meets your criteria of what's going to give you that risk protection, but that can give you then that cyber resilience with the immutable side of things. It can, you know, kind of really kind of give you that kind of speed of setup with that robust protection, and certainly then thinking about making it a lot easier for search and restore of data. And typically in single user events, you know, you're restoring stuff basically straight away. Larger events, of course, are going to take time because it's going to be a large volume of data, but then you can prioritize it, tier it, make sure your primary data sets are coming back sooner. And then that also can support into general your kind of data privacy and GDPR considerations as well. And I suppose then just really to say is kind of some final bits, and we'll just touch on a short side before giving an option to ideally some questions, is, you know, an advantage to the SaaS-based services is they're really easy to test. So because they're a SaaS service, you can get them pretty much basically turned on, which means that pretty much all the providers will provide you with an access to a proof of concept. we would very much highly recommend, we can help things with, like, let's say you want to see Arc server or otherwise, that's really good to be able to get in, see how it works. And if you're even happy with it, it's basically a production setup, because it's no different to a real live environment. So you can almost even take that forward, if that made sense. I would say a thing to kind of keep in note is when you're considering these things, a lot of times it can be seen as a functional or a functional question to answer. I think it's always good to just challenge a little bit back to the authorities that are driving us to do these changes and make these changes, or even challenge it on the context of influence into why they need it, around where the business risk appetite is, and hence what is the right kind of fit and solution that can tie in. And there's certainly probably a bit of more conversation we can have around how to have that conversation, but it's certainly keen to say that why do we need this level of protection? Do we need this level of protection? And hence, like, if we don't, then this is the considerations for it and such like that. And so I think the best way to kind of typically talk about this stuff when you're kind of looking for business support is less to talk about, the threat, and more of talk around risk management and risk mitigation, because ultimately that's what we're looking to try and achieve from a business perspective. We're looking to try and ensure that we are mitigating our risks to the maximum ability the organisation can support. And I think we'll share with you a little bit of the breakdown. It's obviously just been a high level, and although still quite a lot of content, but we can help share with you a little bit of that functional alignment piece, just to provide you a bit of a context and guide as to which bits to think about, which bits not to. And I think just
very quickly, Phil, on the proof of concept trial type of things,
yeah.
Would we recommend, say, for clients to trial a few at the same time? Is that okay, or would you recommend, say, maybe one at a time type of piece?
I think it's a good question. There's nothing stopping you from trialing multiple at the same time. The benefit with these types of products as well is because they're all set up on a connector basis, you can have 5 different ones running all at the same time on your Office 365 tenant, and it make no difference really in the grand scheme of things. Because typically it's only going to be for like smaller number of users, let's say like 10 to 30 users or something like that you're going to be running it against. And then the main kind of difference there would be is around whether you would prefer to do a bit of preamble qualification to say this one sounds better than not, and then do the POC, so you're not necessarily having to spend the time testing across, or if you're happy to spend a bit of time with each, and spend a couple of hours kind of going through testing, playing out restores a little bit, so you can more truly see the differences, then yeah, certainly would kind of encourage a bit of both. I think for me it would be around how clear you are on the specifics of what you feel you need. If you feel you're not 100% certain, that it's good to probably test a couple. If you feel you've got a clear picture of what you want, but you want to make sure it meets it, then yeah, a single one can be fine. And so then just really kind of the piece here is just really more of a statement than anything else. I think it's just really reinforcing that general point around risk. When we talk around these solutions, we talk about both general kind of recovery events for like user mistakes, but also that cyber resilience side. I think, like anything when we talk around cyber, it isn't just one place. But what is fair to say is that, the backup and recovery side comes into this response side. And it's certainly fair to say that actually as a bit of a primary urgency, it's your kind of number one, because if you can't recover, then your other bits kind of unfortunately fall away. But that being said, making sure we can understand the risks and close our security holes as well. So it's certainly something where, although it's the end of the kind of conversation, is the first really in some respects to be having the higher level of urgency, as without an ability to recover, the unfortunate side of things is it could happen at any time. That's not to again sound too threatening, but unfortunately if the impact is not mitigated, then you have a severity of action relevant to that. And so that's really where we kind of think about this more from an urgency perspective to mitigate risk. And so it's certainly key to say there is kind of there. And I think that then brings us pretty much to our kind of just quick Q&A. I think we've got a couple more and we've answered a few, but I hope that information has been useful so far. Trying to kind of keep it relatively high level, although I can talk, as you can all probably guess. But yeah, are there any questions that we? Yeah,
so there's a couple of questions that have come through. So one of them being, does E5 license help cover some of these gaps? So I think this was referring to some of the earlier slides that we're going through in regards to securing the data and kind of maybe what it can do.
Yeah, so the short answer is no, in the context of data protection from a backup side of things. So there is no product in the Microsoft E5 stack that does backup for Microsoft 365. There are plenty of products in there that will help you do. We kind of look back to just this previous slide. the detection and protection layers. So how you can really then better understand your risk and close those security holes. So there's some really good stuff there in the Defender Suite capabilities and stuff, but none of that back up your data. And so none of that actually gives you data protection in the sense of recovery.
Next question we've got here is, what about complex environments with multiple M365 tenants? I think you've touched on this already, but it may be worth just kind of going through that again.
Yeah, so you can kind of slice and dice it both ways. So whether it be multiple M365 tenants that you're wanting to then bring into a single environment, or whether you have kind of one environment but you wanting to slice out and the actual sub management if you want to do more delegation. So we found that, we've got a lot of organizations that actually do the shared services, or you have like parent company and then grouped IT services and stuff like that. So again, it comes back predominantly down to, on the multiple organizations, pretty much consistently across the board, it'll just be multiple connectors that feed in and then pull the data across into it. And so you'll then it'll either show as a single grouped entity with multiple sites on multiple services coming through, or you sometimes find in certain products it'll just have like tenants, depending on what it is. But ultimately, for multiple Office 365 tenants, it's multiple kind of connector sites. Where it would be, let's say, one big tenant, but you want to slice and dice it, the main key thing there is role-based access controls and how you can selectively set discovery. So you want to pay more preference to how do we kind of control granularity of access, as well as selection of discovery, so you can then limit who can see what, basically.
Okay. And lastly, we've got here, what product would you recommend to back up Azure AD, including Intune? Is it possible to back up Azure B2C as well?
Good question. So interestingly, there isn't actually that many products yet on the market that do the backup of Azure AD with different services. Now, the B2C side is an interesting one, actually, because I'm not 100%. I'd have to double check on whether that's covered. But if you wanted to kind of cover both Intune and the side, it might sound like an obvious thing, I'd say, based on what we reference as a product. But actually, Axis SaaS has a P2 version of their AD backup protection, which does cover the Intune services and those extended Azure AD collection sides. So you could double check on the B2C side. But we would primarily recommend the ArcServe side. Microsoft is talking about releasing their own capabilities there, but it's going to be ended up in that Intune suite, and so it'll realistically be cost prohibitive unless you intend to buy all the extra bits, which, to be a bit brutally honest, I kind of still think has been a bit cost prohibitive. But that's yet to be proven, shall we say? So I shouldn't say too much there. But yeah, Microsoft is talking about it. But right now, I would say ArcServe. There are about 2 others that I would know on the market, but I would say ArcServe's got a really nice balance of capability and cost.
That's all the questions.
Oh, all right. Well, really appreciate everyone's time today, and certainly those have kind of, we've obviously good attendance, and so thank you obviously for spending the time. Really do hope this has been useful for you. Try to keep it ideally relevant, but of course we've covered quite a lot of information, and so what we will do is we'll share all the information through, but if you do want to have a chat to make it a little bit more personal to you, we're of course absolutely happy to do that. We can help you with demos, and we'll be sharing a couple of resources out following this that we referenced, and also like a little mini demo so you can kind of see the item in question, like a video demo, so you can just see it a little bit to make some of the stuff we talked about a bit more real if you haven't necessarily seen it before. And then equally, I would say is we'll send out the recording of this within the next 24 hours. But ultimately, thank you very much for spending the time. If you do have questions, please feel free to share them obviously with us. And we really hope that you found the session useful. So thanks very much.
Brilliant.